Donald Trump has told a rally at a U.S. steel plant in Pennsylvania that he intends to double U.S. steel import tariffs to 50%, announcing today between U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel. He also just made an announcement of an expansion of the existing 25% tariffs that were imposed on steel. He just doubled tariffs on all steel imports from 25% to 50%. U.S. President Donald Trump has raised tariffs on steel and aluminum to 50%, further stirring the already turbulent North American trade waters. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America. At a rally on May 30th, 2025, celebrating the blockbuster deal for Japan-based Nippon Steel to invest in U.S. steel, Donald Trump announced that he would raise foreign tariffs on steel imports to 50%. Nobody's going to get around that. No one will be able to avoid it, Trump said of the 25% tariff increase. After his speech, Trump announced on his social media account that the 50% tariff on steel will also be applied to imported aluminum and will take effect on June 4th. The latest announcement hit Canada right in the heart. The country is one of the world's leading producers of steel and aluminum, and the United States is the main buyer of these metals. Canada's response has been harsh, with perhaps its most audacious threat of retaliation to date to cut off or redirect $1.3 billion worth of oil exports. So, how did this issue start with tariffs and end up as an oil trump card? We will analyze the details of the most recent developments in the world together. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like to be informed about our content. The people of Canada, especially factory workers and engineers in the province of Alberta, are outraged. Canadian Prime Minister Carney's team called Trump's 50% steel and aluminum tariffs a direct attack on Canadian workers. The move, which puts Canada at a disadvantage in steel-aluminum trade worth more than $35 billion, was already a challenge. Canada has lobbied hard over the past 2 years to reduce these US-imposed barriers. But Trump's latest announcement overshadowed all efforts. Data compiled by analysts show that Canadian steel-aluminum exports to the US are worth around $35 billion a year. Now, with tariffs doubling, much of this trade is about to become unprofitable. So, what does this mean? It means that the seemingly solid but fragile economic integration between the two countries will be put to a shaky test. Canada is a major supplier of steel and aluminum to the US. US President Donald Trump says he plans to double the tariffs on steel imports from 25% to 50%. What it means for Canada. Trump's view is that if Canada earns too much for its own benefit, then it should pay the price. However, on the Canadian side, this move is perceived as a heavy blow to friendly trade relations. Whereas before even 25–30% tariffs were a challenge, now there is no doubt that an extraordinary level of 50% will have devastating consequences. Canada's big trump card is oil. As the world's fourth largest crude oil producer, the country sells about 4 million barrels a day to the US, and the annual dollar value of this sale is around $103 billion in current figures. The dependence of US refineries on Alberta's heavy oil has been known for decades. Moreover, many American refineries, especially in the Midwest, namely PAD2 and some West Coast plants, are designed precisely to process Canadian heavy crude. So it's a resource that they cannot easily replace. Prime Minister Carney has been talking about this leverage for a long time, which has been publicly characterized as a very radical step. But the Canadian government's idea of turning off the oil valve to the United States was always considered unlikely. Now, with Trump's latest tariff, tensions are running high. Canada could issue a pledge and say, "Oh, US, if you impose a 50% tariff on our steel and aluminum, we will not hesitate to stop our oil flow." Many analysts said on paper, this interruption would cause serious shocks in the US supply chain. After all, the US admits that crude oil from Canada is vital for refineries. Some refineries can normally get heavy oil from the Middle East or Venezuela, but Venezuela is already under US sanctions, and heavy oil from the Middle East is fraught with logistical and political risks. In these circumstances, Canada's cut could be severe enough to be immediately felt by American consumers at the pump. At the same time, the US chemical industry and prochemical plants could face supply shortages. There are those who see Canada's oil trump card as realistic and those who see it as a bluff. Because Canada is dependent on the US, it earns foreign currency by selling more than 90% of its oil to the US market. At first glance, closing the valve to the US would also harm the Canadian economy, but it is important to remember that Canada has recently expanded pipeline projects, such as Trans Mountain, to diversify its export markets. It is now more feasible to sell oil gas from LNG terminals and coastal ports to the Pacific and from there to Asia. Trans Mountain, for example, is approaching 890,000 barrels per day, with an expanded capacity in 2024. Much of the crude oil leaving the province of British Columbia can now be destined for customers like China and India. Last year, about 200,000 barrels per day was sold to Asia. 5 years ago, this figure was almost zero. So it is not that non-US markets are impossible. The infrastructure is growing. The time factor comes into play here. Canada has not yet been able to open the Asian market at full capacity. Transportation costs, the high tariffs of the Trans Mountain Line, the renewal of market contracts, maritime transportation, all require a certain transition period. But if Trump's tariffs become permanent and have the potential to strangle Canada, the Carney government may have to resort to shock measures. Just as Trump said, "I'm strangling our steel and aluminum imports." Carney will say, "I'm cutting oil sales to the United States." Maybe not a complete halt, but quotas or additional taxation. After all, the US is dependent on tens of billions of dollars of crude oil imports. This would be a nightmare for Washington in terms of the economy and especially gasoline prices. Industry figures show that such a move could cost the US $3.35 billion a year. Because without Canadian oil, US refineries would pay higher prices to buy elsewhere. With supplies disrupted, gasoline prices could rise by at least 30 cents per gallon on average. This would fuel voter backlash against Trump. In addition, logistical disruptions would affect the petrochemical sector, worsening the trade balance. Who knows, maybe this will put pressure on Trump to step back. On the other hand, on the Canadian side, cutting oil may be perceived as shooting itself in the foot. Because the Asian market is still not in a position to take full capacity, Trans Mountain has not reached full capacity. Old data shows that capacity is around 77% utilized and is still expected to gradually increase until the end of 2025. So the Khan government may not be able to sell all 4 million barrels to Asia, at least not right now, but they could corner the US with partial cuts or quotas. This is a powerful trump card in trade diplomacy. Economic analysis suggests that this confrontation could light the flames of an inevitable trade war. If Canada cuts oil, will the US get even more aggressive, perhaps raising steel aluminum tariffs to 100%, or will it back down? There is no clear answer as Trump's behavior is unpredictable. But he has to take into account that he could face a serious electoral backlash, such as skyrocketing gasoline prices in the US. With elections on the horizon, the president is the last person who would want a headline that reads gasoline at 5 tiles. Meanwhile, a look at Canada's world ranking of steel and aluminum production shows that Canada ranks 3rd in the world for aluminum and 14th for steel. It has been a reliable supplier to US industry for many years. Many American construction and automotive companies rely on Canadian metal. This supply chain was thought to be unshakable. Now, a 50% tariff means that a deep-rooted bond is about to be severed. Therefore, the Canadian oil move will also throw the US metal sector into disarray. That is from a win-win model to a lose-lose tension. To understand the gravity of the situation, statements from Canadian steel mills are enough. Our steel and aluminum sector could collapse, they say. But at the same time, they add they should not forget that US refineries depend on us. In a way, the message is, if you try to suffocate us, we can cut off your oxygen. Even though there are those in both the Canadian press and the US who say this is all a short-term showdown they will make up later. The numbers speak for themselves. Trump is imposing a 50% tariff on $35 billion of steel-aluminum trade, while Canada is putting its $13 billion oil trump card on the table. On the other hand, if LNG projects and the Trans Mountain Line accelerate, Canada's non-US export capacity will grow. In other words, this time, single market dependence on the US will be minimized. The US could then become the weaker party in the bargain. Of course, the picture is not one-dimensional. Some Canadian experts have asked, is it easy to eliminate the flow of oil to the US market? We have a steady source of income, and losing it would be a huge risk of collapse.